Today's session really brings everything we've been talking about through the flexible learning course together. And it's about how do we answer our audience's questions before they've even asked them. In case this is your first time here, my name is Laura Garcia. I am the training and support manager at First Draft, and you can find me on Twitter at LauraGRB. I love to talk about everything disinfo related. You're new to First Draft as well. We're a nonprofit that researches disinformation, how it spreads across languages, across countries, and also how we can help communities build resilience. Whether those communities are journalists or nurses or health communicators or university professors, we try to bring communities together so that we can all become a little bit more resistant to false and potentially harmful information. Today, we've got three things on the agenda. This is a very jam-packed session. The first one is we're going to explore the concept of data deficits. What are they and why they're really useful to how we think about this work. We're going to talk about prebunking. You might have heard about like debunking, but this is pre and why it's important. And then the last one is just 7 really practical hands-on ideas for getting ahead of misinformation so we can get one step ahead of people trying to spread false misinformation. So let's look at a very recent case study which perfectly exemplifies what a data deficit looks like. So we've all heard different things about the different vaccines. They all have different technologies. They all have different rollouts. They're all being present in different countries at different times. In the US, particularly, the company Johnson & Johnson has developed a vaccine that it just takes one shot. And it's paused for the moment because there's been some rare cases of clotting. Now, if we think about how we relate emotionally to information, this story has everything, right? There's something new, there's something technical, and it's complex, it's emotional, it's about people's health. And even if the chances are 1 in a million, us as people, we think, well, I could be that 1 in a million, right? So it's scary, and no wonder people have questions because there's also a lot of things we don't know yet. That's kind of how science works. So we've seen a lot of different conversations around what's happening, both with Johnson & Johnson, that can be tied to other narratives that are problematic in different ways. So let me give you 2 examples. The one on the left-hand side is an account that normally, like we have identified, spreads a lot of disinformation, and they've tweeted out this particular video that has over 3,000 views of a man called Dr. Michael Yeadon, who's a PhD in respiratory pharmacology, explaining kind of why people taking this vaccine might be suffering blood clots, right? It's important to look at some of the words in this tweet to identify these narratives that it's trying to play into, and also how it's trying to hype up the fear that is built into those narratives. Look at the word. It says Johnson & Johnson gene-based COVID-19 vaccine, which sounds scary, right? And then also highlighting the fact that it's only women, which is true, but it kind of feeds into the narrative that sometimes women's experiences aren't equally represented and all that kind of stuff. The problem with the video is that in the video, Dr. Michael Yeadon makes a parallel between what we're seeing with Johnson & Johnson and some of the other vaccines. So for example, we do know that there have been cases, rare cases of clotting with the AstraZeneca vaccine, but there are no documented cases with some of the other ones. But the doctor in the video immediately makes that link, right? Kind of makes a fallacy logical jump. If one vaccine gives you clots, the other one also gives you clots, then the only thing that can be kind of concluded of all of this is that all vaccines are going to give you clots, which is not necessarily correct. We don't have information to support that, but it feeds into the fear, right? The tweet on the right is someone making the link between the risk of getting a clot from the vaccine and the risk of getting a clot from contraception, which is something that a lot of women in the world decide to take on as a risk, right? And she says, to everyone arguing with us over contraceptive pill risk, we understand the risk of fatality is different. We understand that the clots are different. The point is that there are risks and there are fatalities and no one has ever cared. And it feeds into a narrative that one of our colleagues at First Draft called Lydia Morris, you should check her out, she's amazing, of how because women and their experiences in the medical system can sometimes be really unsatisfactory, that it leads to a lot of questions, it leads to a lot of doubt, and it leads to a predisposition to distrust the medical system, right? And those of us who have experienced the medical system as women maybe have some of those stories to tell, and we can understand that kind of narrative. Nevertheless, If you escalate it by kind of over representing what is happening with vaccines or any other kind of medical issue, then that becomes a problem. The other problem as well is that when we have a vacuum of information, because we still don't know a lot of things, because science is figuring it out, sometimes journalists fill that silence with anything they can find. And sometimes what we do is we just ask people what they think about subjects, which is obviously really important because what people think is relevant and their personal experiences are important. But if that becomes the whole story, we can over or misrepresent what is happening. This is a particular example from a media outlet in the States, where the title says, "Women who receive Johnson & Johnson vaccine concerned over extreme rare blood clotting cases." And most of the story is just doing what we call in journalism a vox pop, which is asking people what they think and how they feel about stuff. Now, these women's thoughts and experiences are obviously completely valid. The first one says, a little concerned just because blood clots are really concerning, especially as a woman. The other one says, you hear all these medical advisors saying it's safe, and then having news coming out of nowhere is a little concerning. But none of these women are doctors or nurses or work in the medical profession. And we also have to be really careful of not letting the narrative then be driven by some of these kind of personal opinions of members of the public, which are important, but we need to always report these in context, right? And give them the right frame so we're not over-representing a perception of risk. Another one that is also coming out of Lydia Morris's research, because she has her eye put on the beat and the link between women's health issues and disinformation. On the left-hand side, we have a tweet saying, "I have so many questions about what they held and put in the vaccines that are making mine and everyone I know's period so much worse and painful than usual, and making people who haven't got a period in years menstruate suddenly. And why didn't anyone research this?" And look at the levels of engagement, right? It's clearly tuning into a concern that people have had. And I've heard from female friends of mine who've been vaccinated that they've had kind of menstrual style cramps after getting the vaccine, and no one's been able to explain why that happens, right? So it is speaking to people's lived experience. But if you looked at the search query vaccine periods on Google before April the 5th, which is when all of these cases started to crop up, there is almost no information to explain either a possible link or not a link, or what we know or what we don't know on the internet, right? So look at the search results. Some of them, the common questions are just kind of driven by Google from what people type into their browsers. So there's clearly an interest in this particular topic, but there's no answers, right? It's also even reading the word period as a period of time rather than periods for women. So look at the results at the bottom. They're about anaphylaxis and different periods and all sorts of different things. And one of the few articles that we could find with this search query, and granted, this might be different now, right? We're talking about when it started to happen because timeliness is important. One of the first articles that we actually did find was another one of these personal experience driven articles. Can the vaccine make your period worse? These women say yes in the Detroit News, which is okay, fine, but it's women's experience. Who are these women? What are, like, we need to kind of put everything in context, right? It's like if I said, if I go outside right now and it's raining, and then I get box up and say, yeah, if you go outside, you'll get wet, and that gets reported as fact. Well, that is clearly misrepresenting what's going on, right? Because it was raining. So this brings us to the topic of data deficits. Everything that we just saw is a perfect explanation of something that we describe as a data deficit. And that means when the supply of credible information doesn't meet the demand. People have lots of questions. They're typing them into their phones and they're finding nothing. Or they're finding people's YouTubes and Facebook pages and blog posts and podcasts, but they're not finding information from credible, verified sources, right? And this might be a byproduct of different things, and we'll talk about how to address these issues in a second. Here's more or less the process of how data deficits happen. On the left, something new, novel is just a fancy word for new, something new or niche or technically complicated is going to happen, right? People have legitimate questions because it's confusing or because they have legitimate questions. A deficit emerges because there's lots of questions that people have in volume and not enough information to meet that. Malicious actors then exploit that deficit by spreading false and misleading claims, by titling their YouTube videos exactly as the questions that people are typing into their browser, or sharing things on Telegram and WhatsApp and closed messaging spaces. Number 5, these methods are then laundered through the information ecosystem. So they move from one platform to another, they spread on closed messaging apps, all that kind of stuff. And number 6, which is the most worrying, these messages amplify attitude shaping narratives. The attitude part is important, right? It's not because it hits us at a time when we have questions. The answers help us shape not only then what we believe, but how we're going to act upon those beliefs. And as journalists or information professionals or NGO workers or health communicators, we can actually see these data deficits coming if we know how to look for them, right? We can tell, right, this is coming up, it's going to be new, it's technically complicated. How can I make sure that there's lots and lots and lots and lots of information that answer people's questions? And the same goes for elections or how to buy a house or any kind of different procedure that you can identify in your industry that people will probably have questions about. And we have to meet it at the right time, right? It's important to monitor when these questions are being asked so we can be there to provide an answer. So how do you spot them? When something's new, technically complex, that aligns with pre-existing narratives that are problematic, for example, anything that has to do with women's health or anything that affects particular communities of color, where there's a political side to it, when it's really emotionally charged, anything that has to do with people's children and families fits in that category, or when there's legitimate questions, right? I'm originally from Mexico. I would have actually legitimate questions of whether vaccines are being properly managed in my country, whether Pfizer vaccines are being kept at the right temperature, because there's a history of mismanagement, all that kind of stuff, right? And we can then start to prepare. We can now identify what's coming rather than react. So that's what we can do. We can do something called prebunking. And prebunking is way more effective than debunking because misinformation is sticky. It's really hard to slow down. It tends to be emotional and therefore memorable, right? So once you've heard it, it's kind of hard to forget what you've heard or what you've read or what you've been forwarded. So better than trying to fight it once it's out there, which we should still do and it's important, let's try and be proactive about it. Debunking is quick, reactive. Once stuff is out there, prebunking is planning ahead, seeing what are the data deficits coming? What questions are people going to have? What questions do people have right now that I can answer, right? And trying to get ahead of these spaces that misinformation uses to spread. So here's 7 really practical ideas for getting ahead of misinformation. And this apply, again, to vaccines, to health misinformation in general, to climate change, to anything. First, warning people that misinformation is coming helps protect them from it. On the right-hand side is one of the latest kind of journal articles that we have found that the research supports this claim. So warning people what kind of hoaxes or false information they might see ahead of time helps them A, spot it, and B, also builds trust with your audience, right? Because you're making them part of the process. Let me show you some examples. On the left, you have Jane Litvinenko, who is an amazing reporter for BuzzFeed News. And she tends to do these running lists of hoaxes whenever there's a big story or a big event. For example, she's done it for a couple of the last mass shootings in the States or for the elections. And what Jane does is that she advertises beforehand that she's going to be collecting these examples. She tells people how they can get in touch with her. She says, here's some of the stuff we've seen in the past that might crop up again, and gives people a way to get in contact with her, and then keeps this running list really available for people to find. So the whole process becomes almost participatory, right? Or on the right-hand side, we have an election example, 6 types of misinformation to be aware of on election day, and what to do if you spot them. There's one particular video, for example, when it comes to elections, of a guy stuffing votes in a ballot box, that we have seen recycled election over election, and not just in the States, but originally the video came from Russia. So stuff like that, warning people what kind of things they might see is really powerful. 2, look for the questions that people are asking. This goes back to some of the monitoring tricks, sorry, that we've seen in the courses before. And if you haven't watched it, you can go and catch up on our YouTube channel or on our website. Using Boolean search queries, you can search for anything that is phrased as a question on social media by adding a question mark. It's that little bit at the end. So you put it in quotations so it looks specifically for that as a character. So my Boolean search query is looking for a vaccine, delay, Canada, and a question mark, right? Any post that contain those words within it. And on the right-hand side, that's one of the tweets that we found earlier in the year using that Boolean search query. Remember that for Booleans, the operators need to be in all caps. And if anyone's watching and speaks other languages or covers bilingual or multilingual communities, your search words can be in different languages, but the operator words, the and, the or, have to be in English and have to be all caps. So look for the questions that people are asking. You can also use something like Google Trends, for example, to help you see how many questions people have about a particular subject and what are the related words they use to search for that, and use that to inform what kind of content you produce to answer those questions, right? And that content doesn't have to be videos. It can be community outreach, it can be events, it can be whatever. 3, do a search on Google or YouTube on a particular topic and have a look at the results and fill in the gaps where information is lacking. So for example, here, we put the words vaccine and injury into YouTube. And almost that first whole page of results, which doesn't mean that's all of them, but it's what YouTube is showing us first, were all individual anecdotes that don't put these side effects into perspective. They're obviously human stories that are really valid and that are important to tell. But if you're worried about vaccines and that is the only thing you see when you type vaccine injury into YouTube, it misrepresents everything else, right? It makes it feel like the entire world or the only answer to your question are those videos. We also forget as well that these search engines, Google, Facebook, Instagram, any of them, tailor results to us. We treat them like if they were information deliverers when they're really not, right? They're learning from the past things that we've searched and the things that we like and the things that we share. So do a search on Google like that, figure out where those holes are and start filling them with good, credible, informative information. 4, think about the search queries that people will actually use, not necessarily the words that we would use to talk about a subject or to search about a subject, right? So for example, when it comes to periods, vaccines, periods, vaccine, women, Johnson & Johnson side effects, vaccine injury, look at that word injury. Maybe we would have searched for vaccine side effects or vaccine possible side effects, but the word injury comes from how the community who is worried about vaccines talks about them. So monitoring the language that different communities use is really important to be able to see what questions they're putting online. Remember that we all talk in swear words and slang and colloquially online, so that your search terms have to adapt to that. And one of our earlier flexible learning course sessions addresses that in depth, and I recommend you go in and see it, just really deep down into how ideology affects language and how that has to be embedded in how you monitor conversations that are happening online to make sure that you're not missing part of the conversation. Number 5, know where people are talking, right? It's like being at a party that has multiple rooms. You kind of have to know which is the room where things are happening. And that will change completely depending on the community that you cover or you serve or you work with, right? This is an example of a site search, going back to how to monitor stuff using Boolean search queries. It's doing site colon facebook.com/groups, which is the subdomain for Facebook groups. And it's searching for the phrase New Jersey and the word información. This is the key bit because it's the Spanish word for information. And any of these words that have to do with coronavirus, COVID-19, coronavirus, and vaccine. Now, check this out, because we were trying to find, and I say we, it's not we, it's my colleague Shada Nayurbani, who's really smart. She was trying to find bilingual communities, right? People who live in the States but speak Spanish. Some of the search terms in that query are in English and some of them are in Spanish because that's how people would talk, right? But you could also include, instead of New Jersey, do New Jersey and Nueva Jersey, or vaccine and vacuna, right? And one of the first groups that she found with that search query is the screenshot on the right. And it says, I'll translate, Group New Jersey COVID-19 Information and Vaccines. And it has 190 members, which is not huge. But maybe if that's the kind of community that you're working with, 190 members might be low, right? 6, make a tip line. Have a way for people to get in contact with you. Involve them in the process of fighting false and misleading information, whether that is an email inbox, a WhatsApp number they can text, some sort of mechanism through Facebook, or what Jane does, for example, by putting it out on Twitter and saying, my DMs are open, send me what you're seeing, all that kind of stuff. Make the process two-way, because we're used to that now, right? Long gone are the days of the kind of distribution broadcast model where journalists or communicators would just tell people what things were. Now everything's a conversation, and you can make really powerful use of that by getting people to contribute to your investigation. And more importantly, because then you're going to get to see the stuff that people are getting on their phones, on WhatsApp and on Facebook Messenger or Telegram or Signal, which is really hard to monitor otherwise. So make a tip line. And 7, bolster your social media presence. Think about creating conversation spaces where you can answer people's questions in a safe and empathetic manner. So for example, you can do an AMA on Reddit or talk with your audience on Facebook or Instagram Live where people can ask questions. Twitter is testing out a new kind of audio conversation space. You can go on Clubhouse if that's where your audience is. That's the important thing. Choose wherever you're going to create these spaces for conversation. Choose them because that's where your audience is, right? Not because you like Twitter or because you like Instagram. And some of these platforms have really good how-to guides of how to go about doing this. So for example, Reddit has an entire media partnerships toolkit on their website, walking you through how AMAs work and how you're supposed to do it and what you can do afterwards, all that kind of stuff. And lastly, and here's kind of where it all comes together. It's important that we recognize the difference between checking facts and building trust. And they're not necessarily always the same thing. Checking facts is about appealing to a source's credibility. So for example, a fact that is quoted in a blog versus a fact that is quoted in a scientific journal. It's about bringing experts that can share what they think and what they see, and about debunks, right? That is about the information that we're talking about. And that's probably really effective for the people who already believe and agree with the work that you and your colleagues are doing. However, that approach doesn't necessarily work with people in communities who might be a little bit more hesitant or who haven't bought into vaccines or their community or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And that is an exercise in building trust. Not about facts, not about information. It's about addressing people's concerns without ridiculing them. It's about affirming and developing their audience's critical thinking. So explaining the process, showing them, not just saying, oh, this is false, saying this is false and this is how I figured out it was false, right? Taking them through the process step by step and identifying trusted sources for that community. And that might not necessarily be government or scientists or institutional figures. For some communities, it's about what people look or what people sound like, right? So for example, if you're part of the South Asian community in the UK and all you see are white British people talking and saying that you should take the vaccine, that doesn't speak to your lived experience at all, right? And for some people, it might be more what people do, sports people, celebrities, anybody. We need to rethink the definition of influencers to anybody with influence. And that might be the community leader, the librarian who organizes everything, the person who makes sure there's always that one neighbor who makes sure that everyone knows what's going on. Or it can be someone a little bit bigger, right? Like singers or sports people or celebrities and stuff like that. Can also be scientists, can also be politicians. But thinking about them instead of their expertise, about how much they're trusted within a community and how you can then use all of that to build trust. So that when you answer questions, you're actually having a conversation with your audience rather than just dictating or lecturing information to them, because that's not going to work.